Hello, creative writing students. I thought I would try out making a video for you since we can't be together in person to see if that's helpful for you in thinking about your stories and thinking about the sample stories we have been reading. So for at least this first one, I thought I'd make a few comments about Shiloh, which most of you have commented on the Moodle forum, and talk about how those would relate to things you want to think about in developing your own story. So, first of all, I want to point out that Shiloh is written in a narrative perspective called third person limited. So most of you know that you could choose to write your story either in the first person, where you use I and speak in the voice of your character, or in the third person, where you use third person pronouns, she, he, they, and talk about your character. And I just wanted to point out that if you choose to use third person for a short story, a version of that called third person limited is usually going to work best. So if you use a different version, third person omniscient, that means that you use those third person pronouns, but the narrator can sort of see inside everybody's mind and know what's happening in different places at the same time. Whereas third person limited means even though you're speaking, the narrator is speaking as though they're from outside your main character, they still only ever have access into the main character's mind. So they might tell us about the actions and words of other characters, but they're never going to tell us about the thoughts and feelings of other characters. It's third person narration, but limited to your main character's awareness and consciousness. And that's what Shiloh is written in. Notice that we get details about Leroy's arguments with and concerns about Mabel and Norma Jean, but we never get inside those other characters' minds. We just get Leroy's thoughts and feelings. So notice how that works. Pay attention to that. Keep that in mind for your story. Now, in terms of plot, the other thing I wanted to point out was that even though Shiloh has this big emotional issue about love and marriage and what holds people together and how do people handle change, those are the big thematic issues. But the plot, the way we see that develop, is accomplished through specific concrete events. We know that Leroy had an accident and had to stop truck driving. We know that Norma Jean now is working more and is taking a class at a school, and these things are changing. And we know that they had a baby they lost that they never really processed grief about. We know that Norma Jean's mother catches her smoking. We know Norma Jean's mother sort of harangues them into taking this little trip to Shiloh. And so it's these specific events that drive the plot forward. And those events are related to this conflict in Leroy. If he's worried about change, he doesn't like change. We see the argument about the log cabin. So it's also this conflict for Leroy about, is he a good husband? Is he going to be a provider? Can he build a house for Norma Jean? Which, of course, he wants, but she doesn't really care about. So keep those things in mind, that you might have a big idea for what the inner conflict is. A character's anxiety or a character's grief or a character's uncertainty. And those are the things that are going to drive the plot, but we will see that conflict. It becomes visible to the reader in the events and the actions. And we want to see a relationship between that. We want to see that issues of the character's own strengths and weaknesses and flaws and motivations and desires, those are the things that push the actions. So, like with Shiloh, we can see that Leroy doesn't like change, and we see that in how he's bothered by the things Norma Jean is doing. And we also see that in the way he drives around the town and notices things that are different. We see that he is concerned about his marriage and whether they really love each other and what their history has been. But that's the big thematic conflict, and it's part of Leroy's character. And it becomes visible to the reader in the actions and the events and the arguments and what they do. So that's something for all of you to keep in mind. You want to let your conflict become, specific enough that we can see it in the way the characters behave. One other thing I'll mention is for some of you that have big ideas about your conflict, that's really great. Also, make sure that you think about fitting those into a scale of a story that is not too huge. I mentioned that on the Moodle forum. Aim to have the events of your story take place within a pretty short period of time. It could take place within a day, but for many of you, it might be a few days to a few weeks. So notice again in Shiloh, the actual events of the story take place within about a few weeks. We meet Leroy and Norma Jean after Leroy's already lost his job. He's been home for a while. Norma Jean has started doing these things that are different. But then from there, it's just a few days. We see him, for example, on the drive where he goes to buy weed from the kid he buys weed from. That brings up also one of those other parts of the conflict when he thinks about how if their baby had lived, he'd be the age of this kid now. So everything is tied together, but with specific actions and events. We get a quick flashback to that baby's death. But the actual frame of the story is within just a short number of days. One other thing I wanted to mention was the issue of setting. That's the next assignment on Moodle. Some of you might have done it already by the time you see this video. But setting also ought to play a role. Just like with poetry, we don't want any wasted words. The same thing applies in short fiction. You want everything to be working towards creating the conflict, creating the characters. And setting can play a role in that too. If a person's in a house or an apartment, some things about what kind of condition that house or apartment are in, or what the objects are, should be related to the character. Notice in Shiloh, one of the things that's pretty significant is that culminating scene where they go and take the trip to Shiloh, where Norma Jean says, I don't want to be married to you anymore. And if you were not familiar already, of course, Shiloh is a Civil War battlefield. And of course, the Civil War is a nation torn apart, a house divided against itself, the rupturing of something. And so the fact that where their marriage breaks apart is at a place where the union of the nation was threatened with breaking apart is significant. So she makes that the final culminating scene of the story. She makes that the name of the story because it has thematic significance. So that's one other thing that this short story Shiloh can be a model of as you think about creating your stories. So those are just a few quick comments on Shiloh and on thinking about keeping your plot sort of under control and making it driven by details of the character. And I will do more of these videos. If they are helpful to you, please let me know. And I will be seeing you around on Moodle.